Hey, Rybot, thanks for your response. First, you describe sentience as subjective experience, and that's fine. Um, I wouldn't say, though, that uh, sentience necessarily implies foresight. Like, I wouldn't want to attribute foresight to a bacterium. That seems to require a more developed and complex degree of consciousness than what a bacterium probably has. A bacterium acts out of pure instinct, as purely instinctual as you can get. Um, but the reason I think there has to be a feeling associated with this instinctual reaction to swim up the gradient is that otherwise I don't see how we ever arrive at subjective experience in more complicated organisms. Um, Now, we should distinguish between consciousness and experience. Uh, you can be, you can have experience without being conscious. Consciousness. Let's reserve that term for human beings when they are awake, alert, um, and thinking verbally or speaking or reading. When you are in that state of rational, waking, egoic consciousness, when you feel like a person and so forth, that's consciousness. And only human beings, so far as we know, have anything like that. But uh, we have this thing that psychologists call the unconscious, and it's what's active during our dreams. But we're still experiencing our dreams, but we're not conscious in them. So experience is somehow more primordial, more fundamental than consciousness. So once we've accepted that, um, I would like to attribute consciousness, or excuse me, I would not want to attribute consciousness to a single cell, a bacterium, or a neuron, but I would want to attribute experience to the bacterium swimming up the gradient and to a neuron. A single neuron, I think, has some small degree of experience. Because otherwise, what is it that makes a certain amount of neurons conscious that when separately they're not conscious? You're going from an entirely mechanical, blind, insentient uh, cell to this global property, which is all of a sudden sentient and conscious, and in fact self-conscious. How does that happen? Uh, I don't know. I have no idea. I wouldn't even know where to begin attempting to explain how it is that a certain number of neurons produces conscious experience, whereas individual neurons are completely blind and dead and have no sentience. People talk about emergence and how, um, from looking at five ants on a table, you would never imagine that 500,000 ants would create this highly organized anthill society. Um, but we can't use the same type of emergence to understand how the brain creates consciousness, because we're not talking about just a higher degree of organization when many neurons are present. We're talking about a whole other new ontological property of experience, which is entirely different than the neurons we supposedly had before, which were not sentient or had no experience. So that there's a neural foundation for consciousness and for experience, I'm not in doubt of at all. But I don't see how we can arrive at consciousness or any experience unless individual neurons also have some degree of experience, and that by combining their small amount of experience, they can produce this more complex, more intense, uh, this more this deeper degree of experience. That makes more sense to me. And see, if we begin with some primitive form of feeling or sentience at the most simple form of life, a single cell, it all of a sudden makes sense how a brain can complexify that simple sentience into this very complicated human kind of consciousness. Um, it just makes everything make sense to assume this. So it's not just that I'm assuming bacterium is feeling and sentient because it disobeys entropy. Um, it's that, and also this fact that if we don't attribute feeling from the very beginning of life, it becomes very difficult to figure out how it ever did arise in more complex organisms. And it seems like there must then be a point where all of a sudden an organism snaps into it and it's experiencing all of a sudden, whereas prior to that it wasn't. It's like there's a huge gap there, a huge explanatory gap that I've yet to come across a satisfactory explanation for. So I'd rather get rid of the necessity of this gap and just assume that sentience was there from the beginning. It's a property of the self-organizing dynamics of a living system. Um, it's still kind of mysterious how a living system becomes sentient, but there are further routes of explanation that we can seek once we've arrived at this point. But just purely on the level of trying to understand life, doesn't it make more sense? Doesn't it solve more problems to assume that the bacterium can feel that it is sentient? Doesn't that sort of give us more of an understanding of what would otherwise be an explanatory gap? I mean, that's my argument here. But, maybe I'm missing something. I don't know. But I'm glad you're interested, and let me know what you think.